June 15, 1944. Saipan. A Japanese intelligence officer presses his headphones tight against his ears, frantically scribbling down every word coming through the American radio transmission. He's intercepted thousands of messages before, broken dozens of codes. But as he listens to this one, his hand freezes mid-stroke. The sounds coming through aren't English. They aren't any language in his code books. And in that moment, hunched over his radio in a bunker that would be overrun within days, he realizes something terrifying. Japan's military intelligence has become completely, utterly blind. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers is often reduced to a feel-good footnote in World War II history. Indigenous Americans helping their country. A clever trick that worked. But that simplification misses the raw genius of what actually happened. And more importantly, it misses the human cost of being the only thing standing between your brothers in arms and death. Because here's what most people don't know. By June 1944, the Navajo Code had become so critical to American operations in the Pacific that commanders were making real-time battlefield decisions based entirely on transmissions that existed in only 29 minds. 29 men held the key to an unbreakable language, and the Japanese knew they existed. They'd heard them. They'd recorded them. They'd thrown their best cryptographers at the problem. They never came close. Let's rewind for a second. 1942. The United States is getting decimated in the Pacific. Not just losing battles, but losing the invisible war that actually matters, the war of information. The Japanese have broken American codes so thoroughly that they're rereading military communications sometimes faster than the intended recipients. They knew about American fleet movements before some American captains did. At the Battle of Savo Island, Japanese forces annihilated an Allied naval force, partially because they'd intercepted and decoded the orders. American commanders were operating blind, terrified to send any meaningful intelligence over radio because they had to assume the Japanese were listening. And they were. The military tried everything: complex cipher machines, codebooks that changed daily, nonsense words. Nothing worked for long. Japanese cryptographers were phenomenal, trained in multiple languages, armed with cutting-edge decryption techniques. They'd crack a new code in days, sometimes hours. Then, a man named Philip Johnston walked into a Marine recruitment office with an idea that sounded absolutely insane. Johnston had grown up on a Navajo reservation, the son of missionaries. He was one of fewer than 30 non-Navajos who spoke the language fluently. And he understood something that would change the war. Navajo wasn't just hard to learn. It was linguistically impossible for an outsider to decode. See, most codes can be broken because they're based on patterns from known languages. You look for repeated letters, common words, grammatical structures. Navajo had none of that familiarity for Japanese ears. It had tones that changed meanings entirely, grammar that worked nothing like Japanese or English, and almost no written documentation existed outside the reservation. But here's the brilliant part. Johnston wasn't proposing Navajo speakers just translate English into Navajo. That would still be vulnerable. Instead, they'd create a code within a language, a Navajo word for every military term that would make no sense even if you somehow spoke Navajo. The first 29 Navajo recruits arrived at Camp Pendleton in May 1942. Most had never left the reservation. They'd grown up in a world where speaking Navajo in government schools got you beaten, where their language was called primitive, useless, something to be stamped out and forgotten. Now the United States Marine Corps was asking them to weaponize it. They created a code from scratch. Turtle meant tank. Ironfish meant submarine. Owl meant reconnaissance plane. They developed a phonetic alphabet. A was wo-la-chi, ant. B was shush, bear. For tactical terms, they got creative. District became the Navajo word for clan. Commanding general translated to war chief. But memorization was just the start. These men had to be Marines first. They went through the same brutal training as everyone else. then additional training to send and receive Navajo transmissions at incredible speed under combat conditions. Because speed wasn't a luxury in the Pacific, it was survival. The first Code Talkers saw combat at Guadalcanal in August 1942, and immediately, commanders realized they had something extraordinary. Messages that took hours to encode and decode with machines were being transmitted in seconds, perfectly, with zero errors. A signal officer named Major Howard Connor would later say that without the Code Talkers, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Think about that. One of the most iconic American victories of the war doesn't happen without 29 men speaking a language their own government had tried to erase. Which brings us back to that Japanese officer on Saipan, June 15, 1944. By this point in the war, the Japanese military knew something was wrong. They'd been hearing these strange transmissions for almost 2 years. And even if they identified it, then what? There were no Navajo speakers in Japan, no dictionaries that would help, no reference materials. But June 15th was different. This was the beginning of the Battle of Saipan, one of the most strategically critical battles in the Pacific. The Americans needed to coordinate complex amphibious landings, artillery positions, air support, naval bombardments, all in real time. The amount of radio traffic was massive, and all of it was in Navajo. Japanese intelligence officers recorded everything. They brought in every linguistic expert they could find. They tried to identify patterns, repeated phrases, anything that might give them a foothold. One officer reportedly spent 3 days listening to the same 10-minute transmission over and over until he suffered a psychological breakdown. Because here's what was maddening for them. They could tell these were military communications. The urgency in the voices was clear. They were hearing the American military coordinate in real time, watching the shape of an invasion unfold through sound alone, and they couldn't understand a single word. The Japanese had cracked American, British, and Australian codes. But 40-plus Navajo Code Talkers were operating on Saipan, sending hundreds of messages, and Japanese intelligence was completely paralyzed. Saipan fell to American forces in July 1944. When Marines swept through captured Japanese positions, they found rooms full of recordings, transcriptions, failed decryption attempts. One intelligence officer had written in his log, "The code is not a code. It is a language we do not possess. That's a remarkable thing to write when you're losing a war. It's an admission of total defeat in one of warfare's most crucial domains." By war's end, more than 400 Navajo men had served as Code Talkers. They participated in every major Marine operation in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945, and the code was never broken. Not once. Not even partially. Think about that in the context of military history. Enigma was broken. Purple was broken. Every supposedly unbreakable code eventually broke, except this one. After the war ended, the Code Talkers were told to never speak about what they did. The code was still classified, might be needed again. So these men came home to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens, carrying secrets that would stay buried for decades. It wasn't until 1968 that the code was finally declassified. Most Code Talkers didn't talk about it even then. Some struggled with PTSD, others just wanted to move on. The recognition came late, small, often inadequate. In 2001, the original 29 Code Talkers were finally awarded Congressional Gold Medals. Only 5 were still alive to receive them. Here is what haunts me about this story. Those Japanese officers on Saipan were probably good at their jobs. Trained, intelligent, resourceful. And they failed completely, not because American technology was better, but because 29 young men from a reservation in the Southwest created something genuinely unbreakable using a language the American government had spent decades trying to destroy. There's profound irony there, and profound justice. The next time you hear about the Navajo Code Talkers, remember, it wasn't just a clever trick. It was linguistic warfare at the highest level. It was young men carrying the weight of thousands of lives in every transmission. It was the sound of an extinct language winning a modern war. And somewhere in the archives, there are still those Japanese recordings from June 15, 1944, hours of urgent Navajo voices coordinating an invasion. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the desperation on the other end. The scrambling. The moment an entire intelligence apparatus realizes it's been beaten by something it never saw coming. 29 men, one unbreakable code, and the sound of history changing frequency. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that changed everything. And drop a comment. What other overlooked stories from World War II should we cover next? Thanks for watching.